Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome Andrea Wadley. She's a pediatrician. Her KevinMD article is titled, How Direct Primary Care Saved My Career and My Life. Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So we'll get into your article in a little bit. First off, just briefly share your story and journey.
Yeah, awesome. So I met and married my husband when I was in residency. So we lived apart for a few years. I knew I was going to move home, which is where he lived. So when I moved back, I got a job as a hospital doctor, pediatrician, newborn doctor. I did that job for 8 years, loved it, but it got to the place where corporate medicine was kind of sucking the joy out of, the actual medicine part of it and seeing the patients. And so at that point in my career, after 8 years, I had been admiring my husband, who was a somewhat new entrepreneur, and looking at him and seeing how, great his life was, when really, he was hiding kind of the hard spots of entrepreneurship, but seeing his flexibility. Additionally, I just knew I didn't want to work for someone else again. And then for 8 years, I had taken care of newborns, which I love, but always imagined taking care of kids, and watching them grow and being called their pediatrician. So all of those things intersected, and, contemplated working for the big hospital system in the area. Most of the pediatric practices are owned by one or, several hospital systems. And it just never worked out. And then I pondered, starting an insurance-based practice, which is, really hard in an area with mostly hospital owned
Yeah.
practices, right? So the little guy doesn't really get the good contracts. I would have to hire several people, and just thought about, what I wanted. So I wanted to be able to be a good doctor, a good pediatrician, but I also wanted to be present for my family.
Sure.
And then during that, kind of exploration, I guess, midlife crisis, maybe, I stumbled upon a Facebook group of doctors who were doing direct primary care. And at the time, it was really only family physicians mostly doing direct primary care. It was somewhat unheard of for a pediatrician to do it. I had, sought out the guidance and experience of some of the concierge type pediatricians, locally and afar, but really there weren't that many. So I jumped in with both feet, decided to do direct primary care, started off doing home visits
Hmm.
because my focus was, and, having been a mom myself, I wanted to go nowhere after I'd had a baby and, dragging her to the pediatrician's office, all that good stuff. I also am breastfeeding medicine. So, doing all of that at home seemed ideal. And then just over the years, people have grown to love the home visit model. And so I've stuck with it for this whole time.
All
So,
right. So you talk more about your journey in your Kevin MD article titled How Direct Primary Care Saved My Career and My Life. Now, before I ask questions about your direct primary care practice, I always want to get a sense of what your life was like when you were a pediatric hospitalist working for someone else for those 8 years or so. You said that corporate medicine interfered with the actual medicine. Give some examples of how that was.
yeah, so it was a newborn hospital group. It was a group of pediatricians started by, a corporation who also owns, different types of medical practices. At first, it was just me and one other doc. And then as the years went on, we expanded into different hospitals. So we would see the newborns that were unassigned, which means, their primary care doctor didn't come to see them in the hospital. So we would see them. And then over time, more and more pediatricians were like, hey, this is a great deal. And so we were seeing the majority of the patients in some of the busier delivery hospitals. So while that was great and wonderful, and we were expanding our expansion was outpacing our staffing. And then there was just a handful of pediatricians, covering, 7 to 8 hospitals all the time. So it had started out as a kind of on for a few days, off for a few days sort of job. And then it became on for weeks at a time, starting practices in new hospitals where people were not familiar with, just the policies and procedures and the fact that they didn't need to call us for everything. And it just got to be a lot, to the place where, the answer was always, well, you're making a lot of money doing it, so keep on. And it's great when you make a lot of money, but if you don't have time to spend that money or see your family, it just got to a place where I just didn't see a path forward as far as them increasing staffing and doing all of those things. Additionally, is something I advocated for was to have nurse practitioners kind of extend and help us, but it became, hey, sign off on all these charts even though you haven't seen these patients. And I just felt uncomfortable using my license in that way because, it's a license that I worked hard
Hmm.
for and it wasn't a job that I planned to have forever. And so just all of that added together to just get to that place where I just needed to do something different. And no harm, no foul. I appreciated all of my time in that job. I just have always been an independent sort of person, want to make my own decisions, have some control over my life. And I just didn't feel like I had that control. And then, because we were traveling between multiple hospitals, I was giving new moms and babies, 2 to 3 minutes of my time
Hmm.
because I was seeing 40 babies at one hospital, driving across town, starting all over and seeing 40 more at a different hospital. And it just, it's just a vulnerable time of life. And it's nice to have a few extra minutes to spend with those families. Um, so, just many doctors experience, I think, a lot of these corporate
Sure.
structure problems as well. So,
Now, when you're looking to transition to something different, you mentioned that you were in a Facebook group of other direct primary care physicians, and you said a lot of them are in family practice, and that is true. I actually don't see a lot of direct primary care pediatricians. So, what was it that made you decide to pursue that particular path when so few pediatricians have done so previously?
so really the main issue with pediatrics and direct care. So direct care is, we charge a monthly membership fee. We don't take any insurance for, the visits in the practice. So the issue is vaccines, really. So vaccine costs are high.
Hmm.
The average baby, the first 2 years of life, gets enough vaccines, and it's close to $2,000 if you pay out of pocket. So that was the issue with pediatrics. Different people have had different solutions over time. And I thankfully was able to work with a company that's able to bill insurance for a vaccine. So I attracted a lot of families at first that had insurance. I used their insurance for the vaccines. I gave the vaccines to their kids. And then they paid me for the visits and the access and all of that good stuff. Since then, pediatricians have gotten really creative. I started a Facebook group specifically for DBC pediatricians because it was such a novel idea. Nobody really understood how to do it, but wanted out of the system. And so now we have over 500 members in the group, and many, many practices are starting up every day. And vaccines are not perfectly solved at this time, but there's ways that we work around it. So I did it, and I wanted to be able, I was jealous of their ability to spend time with the patient. Really, that's
Mm.
what I wanted to do. Yeah.
So, give us a sense of what your typical day is like. How many patients would you see? How long would you spend with each patient?
Yeah, so I have a house calls only model, like I said. So I have a home base, really. I had to have a commercial space to get vaccines and medications. So I share office space with my husband, who's an entrepreneur as well. So it's my home base, and I travel within usually 15 miles of that home office to see patients. So really, a family will find me, they will sign my contract, and then they start their membership with the practice. So I charge the same amount every month on the first. That gives them access to me. So lots of texting. I solve a lot of things over the phone. And then I do all of their child's well visits per the AAP guidelines. I do their vaccines, or I direct them to a place to get their vaccines done. And then I'm also available for sick visits. So in order to drive in a large metro area, I had to kind of shrink my radius. I do have patients outside of that. So, as a result, my goal is to have about 100 patients. So, I really don't do lots and lots of visits every week. Honestly, I cluster, well visits per geography. So, different areas of town, I try and stay and see several patients in that area of town in one day. It just makes the driving a little bit easier. And then for sick visits, it's unscheduled, it's unplanned. A lot of times I can take care of stuff over the phone, but if I can't, I move stuff around and I go see the patient, when they're sick for sure. So on average, some weeks I see no patients and some weeks I see, 10 to 15 patients in a week. I generally can't do more than 5 or 6 in a day unless
Hmm.
it's a lot of siblings. There's just a lot of driving. It's, getting out of the car, getting all the stuff ready, talking with mom, just all of that takes time. But in general, the patients I've seen a lot know well, it's about a 30-minute visit. Some of the newer patients, get an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how many questions mom has. A lot of newborn visits, especially the first few, take longer, just teaching and reassuring parents that they're doing a good job.
I want to ask about that transition period. So you went from becoming a pediatric hospitalist with a relatively steady paycheck to something that was pretty much unknown.
Mhm.
Were you scared during that transition period? Talk about some of your fears and trepidations, and how long did it take you before things stabilized and you had a regular panel of patients in your new practice?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It was really, really scary. It was frightening to step out on my own. My husband had a somewhat new business that was getting a little bit of income for our family. I had some savings from my previous job and used that to start the practice. But really, I was unknown as a general pediatrician. I'd been in the
Mm.
hospital for 8 years, so nobody, and I moved back to the community after residency in medical school. And so really not nobody knew me as a general pediatrician. So it took a lot of talking to anyone that would listen, everyone that would listen. I did, networking, I did marketing groups, I did, social media posts, back in the day when Facebook's, business pages got a lot more reach. I would teach,
Mhm.
different pediatric topics and it would get shared. I had enough, I mean, I've lived kind of in this community for a while, and my husband has lived here longer than me. And so we have a lot of connections. So I would share with, people and they would share my post and tell their friends. And all of that at first was really slow. So I'd get one patient, I'd get another, and it was a slow process. Lots of desire to quit, especially in the beginning. You can ask my husband how many times I wanted to quit. But eventually, at around 18 months, I had enough patients that I was covering my overhead, which my
Mhm.
overhead's not super high, but I was covering overhead and I was starting to be able to pay myself back the investment that I'd made in the practice. And then, really, kind of the 2 to 3 year mark is where things exploded a little bit more. I got to a sort of critical mass. And then during the pandemic, I really just maintained the practice. I added some families that, had reasons why they didn't want to sit in a waiting room. They had a kid on immunosuppressives or something like that. So I did home visits for those families, and some of them stayed and some of them moved back to, a regular office after the pandemic. But really, in the last maybe 12 months or so, I've added enough where I feel like I finally arrived at the goal that I was setting out to do. So I'm paying my bills, I'm contributing to our household income. I'm starting a second vertical for the practice, because I have some cash flow now, which is really nice.
Now, for those pediatricians who may be listening to you on this podcast, what kind of questions should they ask themselves? What kind of characteristics should they have if they're to consider direct primary care going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually mentored several pediatricians to get them started. And a lot of times it really is, you have to have some sort of capital to get started. With DPC, it's not a ton. A traditional practice is lots and lots of money. You're getting a building and hiring people and all that stuff. But with DBC, really $10,000 to $20,000 is, pretty reasonable to get started.
Hmm.
And then if they're leaving a current job, like an employed job, looking at their non-compete and trying to figure out what an ideal scenario would be on starting a practice. I also advise them to kind of do some personal branding. So, if they're leaving a previous job to start a Facebook page that's
Hmm.
just them and, teaching people and starting on social media and kind of becoming a presence and a brand in trying to start a wait list before they start. And then, of course, figuring out vaccines, what it looks like in their part of town and area, and how that's going to be for their patients. And then there's also ways to do DPC pediatrics without worrying about vaccines. So
Hmm.
there's pediatricians that and family medicine doctors that do just trimester care. So you take care of the baby and the mom the first 3 months of life, and then you send them on, and you don't have to worry about vaccines. There's also some friends of mine that are doing mostly mental health and like ADHD evaluations, autism evaluations, that kind of stuff. So you're not really the primary care, and you don't have to worry about vaccines. So just having them examine what their desire is and what that looks like. And then just making sure they know it's hard.
Mm.
Entrepreneurship is hard.
Yeah.
Be being a doctor is hard enough. It used to be where you could hang up a shingle and say, "Hey, I'm a doctor," and people would come to you. And even in fee for service practices, it's not like that anymore. You have to be able to market yourself. So, open houses, networking, meeting the specialist, doing social media, doing video, webinars, those kinds of things. You just have to keep putting yourself out there in order to be able to build a patient panel. And not everybody has that in them, and it's okay. But just knowing that ahead of time are kind of the main things I advise new pediatricians to do.
We're talking to Andrea Wadley. She's a pediatrician. Her KevinMD article is titled How Direct Primary Care Saved My Career and My Life. Andrea, tell us some of your take home messages that you want to leave with the KevinMD audience.
Gosh, I just think that medicine is changing a ton. I never wanted to be an entrepreneur when I was finishing residency, but I just think it's time for physicians to stand up, whether that's becoming, owning your own practice, whether that is using your degree and knowledge for other entrepreneurial adventures. I really believe that we are the change in medicine, and nobody's going to come and change it for us. So if you're considering entrepreneurship, there's plenty of people that can help you, that can cheer you on. If you're a pediatrician and wanting to start your own thing, or a family medicine doctor, we are a well connected group of entrepreneurs and direct primary care physicians, and we would be glad to help you make this transition.
Andrea, thank you so much for sharing your story, time, and insight. And thanks again for coming on the show.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.